I was working selling advertising space outside supermarkets. The first time you do it, you think, I'm just going to get laughed out of the room. Just because they are a buyer and just because you are a seller doesn't mean that they are more important than you. And that's not me being narcissistic, but it's about making sure that if I'm not adding as much value to the call as they are, then why are they taking any value from me?
Welcome to the ISP NextGen Podcast, where we speak to salespeople about their journeys to help you demystify the profession. Today, we are joined by Freddie Lodge, CRO at Certify. Freddie, thank you very much for joining me today. How is it going?
Yeah, very good. Thanks for having me.
Did you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
My name's Freddie. I'm Chief Revenue Officer for Certify. Digital credentialing solutions provider. I'm very new in this role, having spent 3.5 years working in the digital credential space, but now moving into my first sort of leadership role at a smaller company, Certify. My background in sales, I've been working in sales for about coming up to 10 years now in various different capacities, primarily as an individual contributor across lots of different verticals. I sort of took a sideward step in coming into sales. And initially, I worked in hospitality. I was working in hotels and restaurants after leaving college. Had no real aspiration to go into formal education, despite having the opportunity to. And really, as much as I loved the hospitality space and the sector, gained lots of friends and skills and things that I lean on still today, it wasn't necessarily the industry that excited me the most. And sales became such a clear direction for me to go and work forwards in. So yeah, I've had a lot of different sales roles over the years, some good, some bad, lots of stories, lots of fun. But yeah, excited to share a little bit about my experience.
Love that. I think hospitality is this pressure cooker that does produce great salespeople. I've got to say, it develops those soft skills. You really earn your stripes, so to speak. And then when you come into sales, that's when you can learn the sort of more hard skills.
Without a doubt. And I loved my time in hospitality. And if the industry could be more accommodating to living a fruitful life alongside your work, then I think it would be a more attractive industry as a whole. But that's a separate subject. I think what I loved about it, a whole can of worms. But what I loved about it is the ability to welcome, or the responsibility I took on, which was welcoming these people into what was my home, my restaurant, my space, and making sure that their experience was as top tier as it could possibly be. Now, for some people, that's me being very involved with the experience and interacting with them heavily. For some people, they just want to be left on their own and have a nice meal with their family. And that, you have to understanding the nuance and behaviors in that, and being able to react to it, and being, I guess, sensitive to the way that people respond to you is a transferable skill that in sales goes so far, because not every customer is the same. You cannot speak to everybody in the same way and expect the same result. So much of what you do is about listening and observing and understanding social cues and responding to them in accordance with that.
Yeah, indeed. That experience piece, it's so important. I think it was it HBR that did a piece of research and essentially found that 4 out of 5 buyers thought experience was the most important thing, more important than product or price. So it really does. It was Salesforce, sorry. There is another HBR report that's focused on trust, but again, and they go hand in hand. You mentioned some of those skills sort of creeping into or being transferable to sales. In those early days, how did you go about adapting and developing your approach to sales?
Yeah, great question. So my first ever sales role was one of the not very good ones that I'm referring to earlier. So at my first sales role, I was working selling advertising space outside supermarkets. Pretty trash, very old school, really kind of spit and sawdust kind of experience. Smile and dine will pick up the phone 100 times a day, phone a load of local businesses and see who fancies some advertising. And you really cut your teeth doing that. And actually, I think my some of the principles of what I do still today, I lean on the experiences in the past, and the idea of being able to have the confidence to go into a room, with a product, albeit business space, a value that might be useful for that organization that you're speaking to, with the expectation that you're walking out of the room with cash at the end of a 25-minute meeting. And that, for a lot of, certainly for me, age 20, that was quite an overwhelming experience. It's a lot to take on. And the first time you do it, you think, I'm just going to get laughed out of the room. And invariably you are when you start, but you certainly understand that being able to take control of a situation, being able to use those social skills that I was talking about earlier, and, build some rapport, build some engagement, communicate some value, and actually stand next to what you've done and say, this is the product, would you like to buy it? At the end of the day, you have to do that at some point. Yeah. That's always the end goal, I suppose, as a salesperson. That's what we're working towards. Everything that we communicate and the build up to that is ultimately being able to walk away having closed a deal and onboarded a customer, as so to speak. So I guess understanding from an early stage there is a direction towards that, and the basics, the real core basics. And this was just a pure numbers game working in advertising. It was, like I say, 100 phone calls a day, 10 meetings a week, try and just get out there, and maybe you close 3 or 4 deals, you make £3,000 or £4,000. And, back when I was 20, that felt like a mega achievement. And it was, I don't think I would be, it was a pretty trash product if I look back at it now. So I think, I'd be quite impressed if I was able to carry on doing that now. But those skills are really valuable.
No. Yeah, certainly. I can see it now, or I'm getting flashbacks of my days in a similar sort of role, call center, objection handling posters everywhere, or plastered the walls. That sort of Glengarry, Glen Ross, boiler room sort of.
That's it. And I think it's really helpful. I've actually had the pleasure now of mentoring some youngsters that whether they're post-university or pre, that are sort of exploring the sales world and want some guidance. And, in my roles that I've been in recent history, they don't know how good they've got it. They've got this fantastic, tech product. They're working within a really exciting and emerging space, and they get the opportunity to go and sell this. And I envy them, because when I was 20, I was selling literally posters, and there's so little that you can go on there, but you've still got to try and manufacture some value and some excitement. And, it's hard work. And, that's the piece that when I look at the sales world now, I look at my job when I first started was the sort of job that I was ashamed to tell people I was a salesperson, because it felt seedy, it felt underhand. And it's one of the things that the principles that I turn up to work every single day now, and try and make sure that I'm doing the right thing for sales as well as the right thing for me. And there's that ethical stance that's so important. And if we don't challenge the norm every single day, that reputation that sales has as being a negative word or a controversial word, it's not. It's a hugely, good, positive industry to be in. It's somewhere that a lot of people can be really, really successful and have really, long and prosperous careers. And you have to move forwards with those principles that say, no, I'm not an underhand, seedy person. I am doing the right things, and I'm adding value to every business that I work with.
At its core, what sales is helping other people to solve their problems. Yeah. When you boil down to it. Now, how effectively you can help them solve their problems typically is defined during that discovery stage. Are you solving a symptom, or can you actually get to the root cause? It's essentially where deals are won and lost. So I'd love to explore that in a little bit more detail. Now, in your experience, what distinguishes a good discovery process from a great one? Or a great one from a good one, should I say?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's about, you've sort of summed it up already yourself here, but really understanding the impact that your partnership or your work or your product or your interaction with any person makes on their life and their business and their role and their responsibilities. So if you're looking at it on a personal level, identifying who you're speaking with. Are you speaking with a champion? Are you speaking with a decision maker? Very quickly understanding what motivates them within their career or motivates them to the problems that they need solving. And it's not about going an inch deep and a mile wide. It's about really, uncovering that requirement that individuals have. And if you can't do that because, there's barriers up or there's social barriers, which is often the difficult one, especially with outbound, sales these days, there's a lot of resistance. As soon as salesperson phones you and starts asking you probing questions, you put your barriers up and you don't really particularly want to answer them. That's quite normal. So that what differentiates somebody who can do a really positive discovery is actually being able to do that quick questioning, diving deep into the requirements and the business objectives, but also doing so with the customer on their side and making sure that you're feeling like a co-pair, if you like, or you're working together on this project. One of the things that I will always say to any of the mentees that I'm working with in sales is remember that when you go into these conversations that you're equitable in the conversation. So just because they are a buyer and just because you are a seller doesn't mean that they are more important than you. And that's not me being narcissistic, or it's not me being, inflating my self-importance, but it's about making sure that if I'm not adding as much value to the call as they are, then why are they taking any value from me? They're not gaining anything. So it really is about making sure that you have that equity in the conversation, that what you're asking is just as important as what they're answering, because it's helping move them towards their business objectives.
Yeah. I think so. A couple of things and challenges that I've certainly faced. I think initially that idea that was drilled into me, I think, during the days of telesales and then field sales for, let's face it, some questionable companies. Yeah. I won't name them. It very much felt like that sale was a competition. Like you were trying to get one over on the buyer, which obviously isn't the case. As you said, it's that co-creation of a solution. And then secondly, typically the reason that a buyer will be going to the market to find a solution is because they're not quite sure. And don't get me wrong, they've got a ton of information available at their fingertips via a range of sources. But the reason that they're going to market is because they're not an expert in that specific thing. Now, this is what we live and breathe. So it's likely that we've got the answers to some of their questions, or we can direct them to a great resource, or we can go and ask someone in the team for an answer and help them to make a more well-informed decision. And those two things were really sort of transformational.
Without a doubt. Yeah, I completely agree. And often, especially in this world where the buyers are so well informed, there's so much information about more or less every subject out there. Yeah. It comes down to the individual salesperson to try and be the differentiator between, arguably in most industries, quite close parity products. There's rarely something that is vastly different to all of its competitors within a single market, right? So often for the individual is being that Q&A resource, which you've alluded to, being able to deliver that additional insight or that knowledge that they might not be able to access through their research, but also being able to underlie that with value. And that's the key sort of talent, I think, that differentiates some really, really top tier salespeople. It's not about just being a AI robot that responds to the questions. If that was the case, all of these products that we're talking about, all of these sales teams would be removed and replaced with web pages, right? You don't have a B2C Netflix salesperson. You don't phone somebody up and get a sales pitch from Netflix. You know what the product is and you sign up to it online. With all of these other products that do require a sales team, whether it's a tech product, whether it's a software, whether it's a service, whatever it might be, the differentiation that the individual can add is the taking that knowledge and understanding and underlying it with why that's important for the business. And the why is really important. Rarely in these discovery calls do I see positive progression towards a deal if we spend too much time talking about what we want to achieve and less about why it's important. So often it's a really disarming phrase to use if you're ever in a discovery and you're struggling, you feel like we're talking too much about matter of fact on functions and features or anything like that. Just take a step back with your customer. Say, I understand the what. What I really need to understand is why. Because if I can't get that, then we're not making any progress.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to ask it more than once consecutively, because it's rare that first answer is the root core. The root cause, should I say. Now, in terms of ensuring that discovery is one, impactful and you're getting the resource, but also efficient. And, and when I say efficient, what I mean is it can be so easy to get lost in the conversation via various tangents. Do you have any techniques or frameworks that you like to follow?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's techniques that must start from the very first interaction. And there's a principle that you must set within any sales environment. And this starts right from, prospecting and SDR function all the way through to closing and even onboarding and existing customers. And that's about taking control of the conversation. And that happens, just from basic small talk. It's extraordinary how many salespeople that I meet who are unable to talk about, sports, or they defer to the weather simply because it's the easiest thing to talk about, especially if you're working globally. You can ask, well, what's the weather like where you are? It's like, okay, it's good, but it's not great. And if you can start taking control of the experience, and that's, I would talk back in the day when I was doing face-to-face meetings for the very first time, we did handshake practice. It's something as silly as walking into a room and making sure that the person understands the way that you are and what your position is in this conversation. Now, it's very different in the world of Zoom and remote work, but I feel like for me, my camera space is my control area, and it's important that I manage what that looks like. It's important that I manage how I dress. It's important that I get the first word in when we open a call and I'm saying hello and I'm introducing myself and not necessarily being asked to do that. So the principles of managing the conversation and managing the deal flow start right from the very first interaction, and you cannot catch up. You can't start being controlling later on in the conversation. Otherwise, it looks inappropriate. It looks like you've got a vested interest in getting a contract. That's not the principle we're aiming towards. Now, in terms of the context of a deal and making sure that we're really uncovering the correct information to move towards a closed deal, there's frameworks that I lean on, primarily MEDDPICC, which would be, I think, an invaluable framework to make sure that you're really working through the correct elements throughout the experience. Discovery doesn't stop at the start. It carries on throughout the experience. Even once you've onboarded, you still need to be discovering. So MEDDPICC serves as kind of an asynchronous note-taking system for me that helps you to make sure you really have widespread coverage over and control over the rest of your deal.
Yeah. It's a really good point that discovery and qualification, to that matter, they're not one and done tasks. It's really each call you need to be requalifying, just ensuring it's still a priority. What's changed in your world, and try and extract as much information as possible. So that's great. And if let's say you do feel that you're losing control of the conversation, or it's going off track, or you're being taken down a rabbit hole, what techniques do you have, or practical ways to regain? Do you have to regain control of that conversation?
I think it's natural with any conversation that it's organic. It goes in certain directions, and not always does that direction that your conversation goes align with where you want it to in terms of a sales objective or a value proposition or something that your particular product leans into. Now, I'm all for talking for days and days, and my friends give me a lot of grief for that. But when we're working in sales environments, you don't have forever to talk to. You have a very face-to-face time interaction. And it's important to make sure you're maximizing the value of that. And I think it goes back to my point earlier about making sure that you are equitable within the relationship. Just because your customer is buying doesn't mean they get to run over and bulldoze your call. You get to control where the conversation goes. And often just taking a step back and humanizing the experience really can help there. And I find it very empowering to say that we've only got 30 minutes together today. I want to maximize the value that I can bring to you and you can bring to me, which is why I want to take the conversation in this direction. And as long as you're justifying it with the why, and why is a word that I come back to time and time again, but as long as you're explaining why it's important and you're not just, hard cutting away from a conversation that's meaningful for your customer, then you should be fine. And as as a salesperson, our responsibility is to our own time as much as it is to our clients, and making sure that within the short period of time that we have, we get to communicate as much value as possible to justify what is ever increasing prices for our products, right? Because that's how commercial works. But the better we do, the less imposing those costs can often look.
If you could share one piece of advice with your younger self about sales, what would it be?
That's a really tough one. I think if you're doing well or if you're not doing well, just keep doing what you believe is right, I think is the key thing for me. Sales is a life of up and downs, and you have great quarters and you have down quarters, and you have great days and you have down days. And it's often hard to sort of fish for the consistency in there. And I've sort of been the byproduct of this. I remember those days 10 years ago where, you're scrambling to gather a check and you're worried that you're going to get fired at any moment. And my wife, my partner at the time, my girlfriend at the time, would have been in my ear saying, "Are you sure sales is right? This seems really, really high pressure for what you're earning, right?" And deep down, I knew, you keep going, keep pushing a step forward. And, fortunately, I've been able to see my career prosper. But equally, I've been on the other side of it, which I've been flying so high, I can't even see the ground. And I turn up to work and I think, my shit doesn't stink. And, you start behaving differently because you've got this, this ego that you're carrying around with you, which is essential for sales, but, you need to be very much in control of it. And suddenly I find that I'm doing the wrong things rather than the right things because I'm flying so high. Yeah. And oh my God, does it come to haunt you 3 months later when you're suddenly missing all of your targets and you've got no pipeline and you're worried again about losing your job. And so, whether you're doing well or whether you're doing badly, just keep doing the right thing every day. Keep picking up the phone, keep sending the emails, keep trusting in your own instincts and listening to the advice that you're getting. But keep your feet very much on the ground, because I've been stung many times from that.
Yeah, it reminds me of a saying, and I may butcher it, but it goes along the lines of, we don't rise to the level of our goals or objectives, we fall to the level of our processes. So it's really important to have the foundations that, as you said, inevitably you're going to go off, you're going to get carried away. But as long as you've got solid foundations to then reset to, you should be golden, which is great. And talking about frameworks and foundations, let's go a bit deeper on MedPick. Now, why do you think it is so effective in today's sales environment, so effective for creating great buying experiences?
I think the reason that MedPick differentiates, in my mind at least, is that it's not really a methodology, it's more of a toolkit. I say to my mentees that there's no substitute for knowing your literature. You've got to go and read your books, you've got to read Challenger, you've got to read Spin, you can get it all in, drink it all in, but then be really skeptical about it. Think about what doesn't work for you. Those books are excellent. That's why they're bestsellers. Sandler is excellent. Their courses are fantastic. Go and take them. But don't then just lean on them, because you've got to understand what doesn't work for you in order to become your own salesperson. So what you will end up with, if you read all of the other methodologies and you take in all of that knowledge and that understanding about sales, is you'll come with this sort of hodgepodge understanding of what you do as a salesperson, which is fantastic. Harness that, live on it, and build a career on it. But something needs to be constant within that. And that's where I think MedPick can become a really effective toolkit that helps you to make sure whatever your flair or whatever your talent is in terms of developing value, you're still meeting the really crucial elements that actually drive a deal forwards. For me personally, I think the big misconception about MedPick as well is that it's a workflow. And I've been in some horrendous interviews in the past where, whether it's MedPick or Medic, whatever system is that the organization wants you to use, they want it like a checklist, and it is not chronological. It doesn't make any sense chronologically. It's got to be used asynchronously across a deal, but a lot of people think of it as a checklist. So when I'm working with it, just to make sure I'm out of that function with regards to, metrics being number one and economic buy and so on, I don't use that framework. I rewrite it in a fashion that makes a little bit more sense to me, which I've handily called FredPick. But and if anybody wants that template, then they can mark that, do something like that. And I guess I almost counter my own point there by saying it shouldn't be chronological. But for me, the most important value around anything in terms of sales is about understanding what it is, the pain that is being implicated within that solution. Otherwise, there's nothing really there. It doesn't matter if you've got an economic buyer if you're not talking about something that's worthwhile to them. So that's the key thing for me, that really helps to sort of ground all of that knowledge and all of that flair and all of that, hunch, I guess. And we're soft beings, we're squidgy beings, we're not robots. So when we speak to a new person and we think we know how they're responding to it, we're never right. We're invariably wrong, but we can put ourselves some guardrails up by just having certain verticals that we definitely need to cover. And I think MedPick covers that really, really well.
Are there any areas within MedPick that you think or that you've seen been overlooked? Is there one of the areas that people skip ahead, or they don't think it's important, and inevitably ends up biting them in the backside?
Do you know what? I'm going to flip your question around a little bit, just because it gives me an opportunity to share a really funny anecdote. Sales enablement person that I worked with previously. Now, this was a company where we were using Gong, the revenue intelligence platform, which is great, by the way, but it gives you a really good understanding of how deals are progressing in the language that's used. So you can engineer a more sort of repeatable deal. Now, our sales enablement person had started setting up some trigger words in there and came over to me and says, "Freddie, did you know that in 96% of instances where you talk about paper process, you end up winning the deal? I think you should lead with that in your discovery calls." And I was like, "Are you mad? Like, you understand the only reason that I'm speaking about the paper process is because I've done such a good job so far. It's not something that I can just throw at the front of the conversation and think that means, here's the contract, sir. Would you like to sign it?"
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
And suddenly my close rate will hit 96%. Like, I couldn't believe how a data mind, and this goes back to your point about sales being an art and a science, you cannot call it a science, because otherwise that principle of inverting sales would work, and it just doesn't. And you, again, at the end of the day, although all of the points are important, you can't pick at one letter and go, that's the one that really makes the difference. For me, the one that helps me to sort of go back and strictly answer your question, for me, the point in MedPick that really makes the difference in competitive environments is around decision criteria. Because you can have invariably the best product within any space. You can have done your discovery and your sales and your demo perfectly. But if the decision criteria that the client is leading forward with doesn't necessarily lend itself to your message, you can find yourself losing, and you'll feel that it's a wrong loss, and you can feel that you shouldn't have lost. And I think we've all been there where we think we should have won deals and we don't. I think we've also all been there where we've won deals that we think we shouldn't have, which is nobody ever talks about those. But I think decision criteria, if you can really uncover the meaning behind it, decisions behind the decision criteria, if that makes sense, how is that being set and why is it being set in that fashion?
Yeah.
That will really help you to differentiate in those competitive environments.
Yeah, and look, I may be opening a whole other can of worms here, but I think the other thing that comes to mind is how important it is to get in early so that you can help build that decision criteria, or influence.
Yes.
You have more of a chance of influencing that decision criteria, because by the point where an account is in buying mode, they're in that 3 to 5% that are in market, it's likely that they've got a shortlist, they've got their decision criteria, they've actually been helped to build their decision criteria by one of your competitors, but they're just doing their due diligence, So it's important to be speaking to the whole market and then identifying, okay, you might not be buying right now, but how can we work together and get to that point when the timing is right?
Yeah, I agree. I think in my new capacity, working across all of revenue and sales and marketing, I think it shines a light, that point that you've made there, on how they need to be so close together. Marketers need to be selling and the sellers need to be marketing, because we don't know where we pick people up within that journey. Ideally, it's at that sweet spot that you've just spoken about, where they're thinking about buying, but they haven't spoken to anybody yet. That's the perfect case. But find me somebody who can, accurately and repeatably, scale that. That doesn't exist. So making sure that your marketers are still consistent with sales messaging to make sure that those people who are still in exploratory stage are still being sold to, because we do want to influence those decision criteria and the evaluations that clients have. But equally, those people that we're late on with, sure, you might have spoken to 7 other partners, but that, again, it doesn't mean that you don't take me seriously, or it doesn't necessarily mean that I've already lost. Give me the opportunity and make sure that I'm able to take control of that scenario. There's a lot of talent from lots of different job roles that are really important. So bring sales and marketing close together. Marketers don't think we're scary people in sales. We're not. We're very much in need of your help in a modern sales world, and likewise, you guys are in need of ours.
This has been a super insightful session. I do have one more question for you before we close, though. What one piece of advice would you give to listeners that they can go and implement as soon as they stop listening to this podcast?
Oh, great question. For me, I think it's about just putting control in your environment. So if you work on Zoom, sort your background out, turn your blur filter off and sort your background out. Don't have your washing and your drying out behind you. Try not to have your cat running past and so on. For me, I'm kind of sticky about these kinds of things, but the professionalism that you bring into that little square box is the same professionalism that you should be taking if you go and shake anyone's hand, right? You wouldn't turn up with your tracksuit bottoms on when you go into a meeting room, and the same applies when you're on Zoom. If you're on a phone call, make sure you're bringing your A game to every single conversation that you're having. Dial up that professionalism. It is a visual medium, as much as that might be a controversial statement. It's a visual medium, it's a communicative medium, and people are making judgments on you, rightly or wrongly. Try as much as you can to control that, because that control will help you to transition that control throughout your deal.
Yeah. Brilliant. Freddie, thank you so much for joining me today. If anyone does want to reach out, I guess LinkedIn probably the best place.
Yeah, LinkedIn, or reach out to me via my email, freddie@certify.one. Happy to answer any questions. If there's any young people out there that are exploring sales careers, happy to offer mentorship as well. I'm really passionate about young people getting into sales for the good reasons. And I'm happy to work with anybody who's curious or wants to ask any questions.
Thank you again, and to everyone listening, until next time. Next week on the the ISP NextGen Podcast.
Surrounded by idiots. Actually, rejection's fine and you are good at your job. You're just being consultative, help the person understand what it is, and then you get better results from that.
Genuine curiosity is your superpower.
Because if it's not going to be right and it's not right for the client, then it falls on our head. It took like 230 days to close.